Welcome to Hamburgers and Horror, the home of meat, monsters, and massacres that aren't quite what they seem. I'm Noah Hook, and today we're looking at Savageland. This 2015 mockumentary horror film is presented entirely as a documentary about a fictional mass killing in a small Arizona border town. The lone survivor, an undocumented immigrant from the town, winds up being pinned as the prime suspect for the brutal killings. The police and other locals are satisfied with this easy answer, but a series of haunting photographs the survivor took lead others to believe that something much more sinister swept through the town on that fateful night. This documentary sets out to find the truth. Savageland was directed by a trio of colleagues and friends, David Whelan, Simon Herbert, and Phil Guidry. Hoping to make their way into the film industry while also hoping to avoid selling spec scripts, they decided to produce their own indie film. They came up with the idea of a found footage film, but one that actually prioritizes photos over video. Whelan, Herbert, and Guidry's guiding philosophy was that every component needed to feel real. Whelan wanted to make a film that if someone put it on not knowing it was fictional, would really believe it was real and start Googling this incident. And this is going to be my one and only warning, this is absolutely a film to go and watch for yourself in its entirety before watching a spoiler-heavy review like this one is going to be. It's free to watch on YouTube, free to watch on Tubi, there's a lot of great options, and yeah, definitely go give it a watch if you haven't seen it before. From here on out, we're going into all the messy details. The film is largely centered around a series of haunting photos taken the night of the massacre. These images were primarily created by the actor who plays the film's central figure. Savageland stars Noe Montez, who is a real-life photographer and artist. The filmmakers primarily casted him because of his artistic background and because he could produce such cool work. The rest of the cast is almost entirely made up of actors you've never heard of, who do a great job selling themselves as locals, police, journalists, and conspiracy theorists. The film also stars Edward Green as Gus Greer, J.C. Carlos as Carlos Olivares, Valen Rain as Grace Putnam, Lawrence Ross as himself, and George Lionel Savage as Sheriff John Pirano. Cinematography was handled by Turner Jumonville of the Mars generation, who focused on giving the interviews and B-roll the look of a documentary. The film's sound design was co-created by Matt Eagleson of Hollywood 911 and Kent Federico of The Substitute. The film was made on very limited resources, which shaped a lot of its creative decisions. They utilized minimal locations, the story takes place in a tiny town, and most of the interviews take place in nondescript rooms and desert landscapes. Because most of the film is interviews and still images, the crew avoided costly stunt work, prosthetics, and large sets while still creating the impression of a catastrophic event. Savageland premiered on the festival circuit and quickly grew word of mouth with horror fans once it hit streaming. Viewers and critics often praised its innovative use of photography, its slow, creeping dread, and its surprisingly believable documentary style. Many fans consider it one of the more original mockumentary horror films of the 2010s, especially because it manages to feel so brutal while technically showing very little. Many fans also appreciate the film's political subtext, but I'll be getting much more into that after the breakdown. The film actually doesn't have enough reviews for a critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, but it does have a 62% audience score, along with a 3.3 on Letterboxd. Thank you so much to my patron Victor from the Horror Movie Syllabus for requesting Savageland for me to review. This was a first time watch for me and I was able to go in with zero spoilers, and spoiler alert, I had a really good time with it. And hey, if you end up enjoying this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all my future horror reviews as well. And if you really like it, consider joining the Patreon. You get a few different perks, including once in a while getting to literally pick a film for me to review. So I'd say it's worth it for just $5 a month. But hey, with all of that said, it's probably time we get started. Go grab your cameras, y'all, because we're watching Savageland. The movie opens with a series of news reports and interviews, which explain that on the night of June 2nd, 2011, The border town of Sangre de Cristo in Arizona was besieged by an undisclosed incident resulting in the grisly massacre of the town's entire population of 57 residents.
A person of interest was detained.
We found the suspect covered in blood.
An illegal immigrant named Francisco Salazar, who lived on the outskirts of town, was the sole survivor and prime suspect. Many locals believe Salazar is guilty, one citing that Mexicans are dangerous animals, while others aren't so sure. That night, Salazar allegedly took a series of photos which paint an even more terrifying image of what happened that night. The documentary crew drives through the ghost town, which appears to have been a quiet, secluded place surrounded by desert. 2 days after the massacre, the county sheriff, John Pirano, held a press conference. He says he's never encountered violence so widespread and brutal. Lawrence Ross, an investigative journalist and author, is probably the closest thing we have to a host for this documentary, and he questions why this gruesome mass murder got practically zero news coverage.
It's hard to imagine the scale of the carnage. Most bodies were only partial remains, scraps of bloody clothing, limbs in the street.
The bodies of most residents were never found, and the remains of the victims that were found were dismembered and covered with human bite marks. There were blood trails leading miles away from the town, as though the corpses had been dragged all the way out there. Ross explains that Sangre de Cristo is the vanishing capital of the US. Dan DeLuca, a deputy from the neighboring town of Heinzman, notes that illegal immigration, drug trafficking, and cartel dealings lead to many people disappearing from the area overnight. Francisco Salazar allegedly jumped the border 6 years ago and had lived in Sangre de Cristo, or SDC for short, ever since. This made him an easy and believable suspect in most people's eyes. Sheriff Pirano shares that Salazar is the only person that has ever truly scared him, reflecting on how he was raving mad when they first found him. A truck driver found him 12 miles outside of town after the massacre, and it was the hospital staff who called the police once they saw his condition. According to Pirano, Salazar was a loner, had anger issues, and a bizarre fixation for taking photos. A few Heinzman locals recall him taking pictures of children and dead animals. A right-wing podcaster from Heinzman named Gus Greer has used the massacre to broadcast his hatred for illegal immigrants.
The Mexican, the Cholo, La Raza. It's a culture that celebrates violence. They glorify death because they have nothing else to look forward to.
He's used this tragedy to push his own message, calling for white people to fight back and take control of Arizona. Salazar's public defender, who was apparently on his third case ever when assigned to this, denies that racism and xenophobia played any role in the investigation, while documentation of nearby protests paints a very different picture. In Mexico, Salazar's sister states that her brother is not a monster and couldn't have done what they said he did. Once the trial revealed that Salazar apparently ate parts of his victims, most of the locals turned against him and hoped for the death penalty. They were presented with a one-man army, but those people didn't get the bigger picture. Nobody mentioned that the bite marks on the victims didn't match Salazar's teeth, nor did they mention that Salazar had bite marks on his own body that matched some of the victims. Forensics could only be done on 7 partial corpses, as the rest were so annihilated and jumbled up together across the town. Carlos Olivares, a retired Border Patrol officer, shares that during his years patrolling the border, he'd occasionally come across corpses that had been partially eaten by humans. But nobody dared talk about it. Salazar never spoke a word during his trial, and he was sentenced to death via lethal injection. Due to state laws, he was given an automatic appeal though. Ross spent the entire first trial trying to get access to Salazar's police interview from the morning after the massacre, but he was swiftly ignored at first. After continued fighting, he was eventually sent the tape, but it was not allowed as evidence in either trial. It sounded like the ramblings of a madman, but people like Ross and Olivares think there might be truth to it.
You said that they were people that you knew, but something wasn't right about them.
They were the same people, but they were dead.
Renee Davies, a psychotherapist for the Heinzman Police Department, was the one who interviewed Salazar. It took him a long time to even start speaking coherently, only being able to sing a childhood song for the first few minutes. While his story was bizarre, Davies found him to be completely sane. When Salazar was first picked up, all he had on him was his 35mm camera and a flash unit. He was well known in town for always carrying it and documenting all kinds of mundane and strange moments throughout the day. One particular subject that Salazar documented, which the prosecution used against him, was a local girl named Grace Putnam. Pirano found them to be quite suggestive, believing Salazar to be a pervert. Len Matheson, an award-winning photographer, sees the contrast between his photos as a beautiful juxtaposition between life and death. But it wasn't until the appeal started that the truck driver contacted Ross, telling him he found this roll of film in the cab of his truck. It had been left by Salazar the night he picked him up. Turns out he documented his every move that night.
Something primal, horrible moved through Sangre de Cristo that night, and the one survivor made a record of it.
Ross, Olivares, Matheson, and Maria believe that the images are real, while Greer, the public defender, and sheriff believe they prove nothing. Ross hired Olivares to take the crew on a step-by-step recreation of Salazar's journey through SDC, starting with the first victim he encountered. We begin the journey at Salazar's trailer, which is a mile outside the heart of town. It was a regular evening when 17-year-old Danny Montez burst in, covered in blood. Salazar tried to help, but the mutilated kid bled to death on his couch. But according to Salazar, Danny's body came back to life and attacked him. Salazar fought back to defend himself, ultimately stabbing him 30 times with a pickaxe to put him down. There's no question that Salazar did this, but if he killed a man in cold blood, why would he run into town for help? Because south was not an option. The first photo Salazar took was the hills behind his home, where a horde of frenzied figures can be seen rushing towards him. He ran towards town through the fields where many migrants were still working. It's explained that most of the community were migrants, invisible people that white people of Heinzman would frequently dehumanize.
When we were kids, we couldn't even pronounce the damn place. We were like, Sangre de Caso, Sangre de Cristo. We just call it Savageland.
11 migrant workers were slaughtered in the very field they worked so hard in. People first assumed the massacre was a cartel job due to the sheer scale, but the randomness didn't match their MO. Salazar next encountered a hunter from Heinzman named Ron Templeton. He was a white, powerful, beloved part of the Heinzman community, and his death is one of the reasons this story even became news at all. He was a marksman, and his wife struggles to believe Salazar killed him all by himself. Salazar claims Templeton shot his pursuers, but bullets didn't stop them. This is backed by photo number 4, which shows the man being swarmed. Of 57 deceased people, the only obituary in the Heinzman newspaper was for the one white guy from Heinzman. This brings Salazar to the edge of town as the sun sets, where Sangre de Cristo is being ravaged. Ooh, look at these spooky fuckers. The word zombie is never used in the film, but I'm going to start referring to these creatures as zombies just to keep things simple. On one end, Pirano believes Salazar used his knowledge of the town to efficiently kill everyone in it, while Ross and the others believe no one man could do this much damage.
Salazar knew every square inch of that town. That's why he was able to move so quickly and kill without anybody realizing what was happening.
He made it to the only grocery store in town, presumably to use the landline phone, but it was already swarmed. Most of the migrants didn't have cell phones, just phone cards they would occasionally use to catch up with family across the border. This is why there was no documentation outside of Salazar's photos. But Salazar was charged for murders in locations he didn't take pictures of, and that there is no evidence that he was ever in. This includes a water tower that 8 locals climbed up and jumped off of to their deaths. Supposedly, 8 people jumped to their own deaths instead of fighting off one man. According to the photos, Salazar actually made his way to the church where he knew the Putnam family would be. He worked for them for years fixing up the church, and they trusted him to the point where he had his own key. Why would he rip the door off the hinges if he had a key? At 8:19 p.m., Dwayne Putnam made a single call from the church landline, leaving a voicemail to a fellow pastor.
Grace is gone. Don't judge me. Don't you judge me. Only God can judge me. Only He knows what I'm seeing. Only He knows this abomination.
According to Pirano, Dwayne killed his wife, son, and himself with a machete shortly after. But according to Salazar and his camera, something else got to them first. Salazar then braved the most populated part of town to get to the school where Grace Putnam would have still been. He documented even more carnage along the way. 9 students were still at the school waiting for parents who would never arrive. According to Salazar, 8 of them, along with their teacher, had already been ripped apart. We get a sad series of interviews with family members of the kids.
You know, it was a closed casket. All the family was there. A lot of people wish that they would have been able to see her before she went.
He did find Grace at the school, but he was too late to save her. He tried to use his flash to scare the zombies away, but it didn't work. All he could manage to do was take pictures documenting her final moments.
She was on the other side of the window. She was reaching out. Couldn't help her.
Matheson questions why he wasted the last of his film on her, and why he broke the photographer's code by actually intervening and holding her hand. He sang to her while she was eaten alive.
Que nació de día, quiere que la lleven a la dulcería. Esta niña linda que nació de noche, quiere que la lleven a pasear en...
Salazar went into a catatonic state by the end of his interrogation. 1 week before his appeal verdict, Ross published a new book on the SDC massacre. He believes it was tried and true hatred that swept through the town, a group of white men, possibly police, who wanted to rid their country of these invisible people. A few unlucky white people just happened to get in the way as well and couldn't be left as witnesses. Salazar's conviction was upheld, and Heinzman became a national leader in immigration crackdowns. They will do everything they can to keep the next Francisco Salazar out. Pirano was re-elected for the 8th time, who had been publicly excited for Salazar's upcoming execution. Francisco was executed via lethal injection on February 3rd, 2013.
At 12:05 a.m. Arizona time. Not bleeding liberal time. Not East Coast wine and cheese time. Not West Coast free drugs time. American justice was served.
The court killed his photos and the state killed him. Even after his death, Greer continued to smear Salazar's name, complaining that he was buried on American soil. Shortly after, his body was stolen and never found. But Salazar's legacy lives on through his photos, as many people now believe he documented the truth of what happened that night.
Except they got it all wrong. This doesn't end with the execution of Francisco Salazar. Francisco Salazar's photos don't end with Francisco Salazar.
But most people will continue to sleep better at night thinking they are fake, so why would the police make their lives harder by admitting they are real? But while Ross still believes living human beings are to blame, Olivares is one of the few to believe something inhuman is responsible. He claims this horde of the living dead came from the south, destroyed the town, and continued moving north until no blood trails could be found. The bodies weren't buried or dragged away, they got up and walked away. A small group now views Salazar as a martyr, fully believing he was an easy scapegoat for the real evil lurking out there. 7 weeks after the massacre, a pair of campers were viciously murdered in a national park 100 miles north of SDC. Similar attacks have quietly swept through Arizona and New Mexico over the past years, resulting in butchered bodies and missing people in every case. Park rangers recovered a video camera from one of the campsite crime scenes, which is what the movie ends on. And that's Savageland. Yeah, this one was a really pleasant surprise. As far as first-time watches go, this is the most engaged and glued to the screen I've been in a while. I wasn't sure about the documentary format at first. I already watch a lot of true crime and worried that this film would either feel really cheap and crappy or too much more like a narrative film in comparison. But I'm happily wrong. Savageland convincingly feels like a legitimate low-budget documentary that's taken a haunting turn. If you put this on for a friend and told them it was just a real documentary, I'm convinced that most people would be on board for at least the first 30 minutes or so before asking some crazy questions. The interviews authentically feel like low-budget local news and the kind of cable true crime you'd watch at a sketchy motel, which as a person who travels a lot for work, I have a real soft spot for. The pacing mimics actual investigative documentaries. There's enough misdirection and secrets slowly trickled in throughout to keep me really guessing on what's happening next. The film unfolds via interviews, forensic analysis, police evidence, and the photographs Salazar supposedly took during the attack. This documentary framing gives the film its power. Instead of just showing straight up zombie carnage on screen and through video, it allows us to use our own imaginations while we look through the photographs and listen to different testimonials, so we can really run wild with what might have happened that night. It's definitely a slow burn, but the dread accumulates in a way found footage rarely manages to achieve. For reference, I'm really picky when it comes to found footage horror. I think it's super rare to find a film that's doing something genuinely unique with the format. I find that most are really good at setting up the stakes and building the dread at first, but at some point they start to fizzle out and never quite capitalize on that initial promise. This will be a bit divisive, but I was disappointed in different mockumentary horror films like The Bay, the Poughkeepsie Tapes, and Lake Mungo for those exact reasons. But I feel that Savageland manages to build dread and atmosphere, and despite having very little action, it builds that dread throughout to make a compelling finale and conclusion. The film's biggest achievement and most unique quality is its commitment to still images as the primary visual narrative. The photos taken by Salazar are ambiguous and grainy, often requiring the viewer to interpret them like crime scene evidence. You have to really get up close to the screen and inspect it closely, making every little detail you find in these crime scene photos something you feel almost complicit in. But it is what is lurking in those photos that makes Savageland so special. These images are so fucking scary. Like, they are genuinely haunting and gruesome. The use of darkness and graininess, along with the use of long exposure to create blurriness and movement, help give the images so much atmosphere. Using the word zombie doesn't do these creatures justice. While they are clearly gruesome, blood-soaked, and primal, they also have a haunting, ghostly stillness in the photos that makes them even scarier. I was so impressed by how well these photos commanded the screen. I'll admit that I lost interest once in a while when the interviews were happening, but I never felt stagnant or bored when those images were on screen. Another element of Savageland that is really refreshing is its sharp political commentary. Savageland operates as both a horror film and a critique of the American border narrative, using the language of true crime media to expose how prejudice shapes public perception long before facts do. The central premise is that an entire town was wiped out overnight, yet the police, the media, and the population surrounding the area all immediately pin it on one single man. Even before evidence is examined, Salazar's undocumented status becomes the reason he is suspected, the explanation for the violence, a narrative used to create more fear, and justification for a rushed prosecution. This parallels patterns we're seeing in the US. Crises are often pinned on the most marginalized, not because of evidence, but because it's politically convenient. And that's what makes the documentary format so essential here. The film mimics sensationalist news reports, biased talking heads, and community members voicing fear steeped in racism. By structuring the story like investigative TV, the filmmakers reveal how easily the media can frame someone as dangerous through tone, editing, and selective testimony, even when the actual evidence suggests the opposite. They do a good job of making it feel like Salazar is the perpetrator up front, which makes it all the more satisfying but also devastating by the time we get to the end where the rug is pulled out from under us, the truth is revealed, but it's also denied by all of the people in power who can actually make a decision on the matter. The justice system in Savageland doesn't seek the truth, it seeks a clean and tidy answer that fits their narrative. When people are afraid, they want a simple explanation, preferably one with a villain they already distrust. Salazar becomes that villain. The townspeople's comments echo familiar anti-immigrant talking points. He didn't belong here anyway. We never trusted him. Those people are all savages. Fear creates a vacuum that prejudice rushes to fill in. Salazar is a poor, undocumented, isolated migrant worker whose presence is tolerated but never welcomed. When tragedy strikes, his invisibility becomes hypervisibility. Suddenly everybody noticed him, but only as a suspect. This mirrors a broader truth. Marginalized laborers are often ignored until society needs someone to blame. Savageland feels so eerily relevant to America today because its political commentary mirrors patterns that continue to shape US culture, media, and policy in 2026, especially around immigration, criminal justice, and how fear gets weaponized. The film, of course, leaves you haunted and horrified by the images of the zombies, but you're also leaving so frustrated by the lack of justice by the end. This is a great example of the plot and the themes feeding into each other so perfectly, as opposed to one really taking over the other. I will be the first to admit that this is not a film that's going to work for everyone. If you don't like found footage and mockumentaries, there's a decent chance that this is not going to be the film that changes your mind. If you hate low-budget crime documentaries, you're probably going to hate how accurately this curates that vibe. And it's definitely not an ending that provides any hope or closure, so you will have to accept that there's a lot of questions that remain unanswered by the end. But despite the low-budget nature, I think Savageland makes up for it with surprisingly convincing performances, a great desert border town atmosphere, sharp political commentary, and some truly imaginative and compelling imagery that stays with you long after your first watch. Ultimately, Savageland succeeds because it understands that the scariest things are what we fill in ourselves. By withholding the gruesome spectacle and replacing it with suggestive photographs, fragmented timelines, and whispered rumors, the film taps into a primal fear. The terror of the unknown, the blurry, the half-seen, the thing hiding in the shadows. We get little slivers of these ghouls emerging from the hillsides, popping up in the darkness, and a few fleeting images of them ripping people to shreds, but that's it. We're forced to fill in the blanks ourselves, imagining how all of these people we met through photos spent their final moments. It stands out to me as one of the most compelling mockumentary-style horror films of its decade, not because of jump scares or gore, but because the horror is so still, frozen in time. It makes you sit there and confront what you're seeing in a really rare, special way. If you're a fan of true crime, documentaries, slow burns, and surprise zombies, this is definitely one to check out. Well, that's about it. Thank you so much to my patron Victor for requesting Savageland for me to review. This was admittedly pretty challenging to reorient into a review because it's so chopped up and dialogue focused, but it was so worth it to finally watch this really great hidden gem. But have any of you seen Savageland? And if so, what did you think of it? Be sure to share your thoughts with me down below. And while you're at it, share your favorite horror found footage films as well as mockumentaries down below. And be sure to join me next time as we check out A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master. Thank you all so much for joining me, and an extra thank you to my patrons. As always, I'm Noah Hook, and thanks so much for watching Hamburgers and Horror. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching my review of Savageland. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all my horror reviews. And if you want to help support the channel further, you should check out my Patreon account. You'll be able to vote for future movies and franchises I cover on the channel. Thanks y'all.